today's talk, Praise Poetry and Sport in Ancient Greece.
Yep. Okay, thanks, Ruth, and thanks everyone for coming in advance, for persevering in this uncomfortable room. Oops, there we go. At the Olympics of 472 BCE, Ergoteles, a Cretan exile who now lived in Himera in Sicily, won the Dolichos, the long-distance run that was a specialty of Cretan athletes. Sometime soon after, he commissioned Pindar, the Theban poet, to compose a short song celebrating the victory. Pindar's song broadened its scope beyond athletics, as he generally did, and situated Ergoteles' victory as predestined, even in a world where, as he writes, many things happen against what we think. Pindar also included, presumably at his patron's insistence, a reference to Ergoteles' original homeland, that is Crete, and the reason, involvement in stasis or civil strife or civil war, for his exile from it. To Ergoteles, therefore, this involvement must not have been shameful. We might think that would sound shameful, since it resulted in his arrival in Sicily, his eventual settlement in Himera, and of course, in the poem at least, his Olympic victory. Some years later, after concluding a highly successful athletic career, Ergoteles erected a victory monument at Olympia and commissioned a short verse inscription on a bronze plate for the base. You can see it in this image. The inscription recorded his name, his father's name, a catalog of victories, and ended by referring to the whole monument as an immortal memorial for Himera. By now, at the end of his career, he did not include in this inscription his original homeland. These two poems, both of which are relatively short, 20 lines in the case of Pindar and 4 lines in the case of the inscription, offer an insight into the epination and epigrammatic representation of athletes and athletics, and the ways in which both genres represent and use the angelia, a word I'm going to use about 1,500 times in the course of this presentation, the angelia being the herald's proclamation of victory at the games. In no other case do we have an epigram and an epination song for the same victor. This is the only case where we have a poem and an inscription for the same guy. And so these two give us great insight into how and why athletes dedicated poems and statues, how each genre was similar and different, how we can speculate on audience responses to these poems, monuments, and songs. So I'll start with Pindar, though most of this talk will be about inscriptions. In Olympian 12, Pindar's song, the change of polis or city-state is thematized across the ode with alteration and the possibility that change leads, sometimes unexpectedly, to success is a key message. In the epigram, however, Ergoteles appears as just another ancient Greek aristocrat inscribing his victories at the end of his illustrious career. Both texts use one category of the proclamation to construct an identity. They each manipulate the angelia or proclamation to establish their authority and render praise to their subject. Olympian 12 opens with a maritime scene that depicts a world of inscrutability and ties it to the career of this 1/5th century athlete. Unpredictability across the poem is the central theme, and Ergoteles' life is made to fit a kind of story type, where a man suffers exile from his homeland, but fortune turns this all to the good by establishing him in a new city where he gains distinctions he would not otherwise have won. So all's well that ends well, kind of, in a way. The details of Ergoteles' career, however, that is involvement in civil strife, exile, settlement in Sicily, citizenship in this new city, and finally a Pan-Hellenic victory at the Olympic Games, don't necessarily mean this schematization had to happen. Rather, from one element of the proclamation, Ergoteles' city-state and its strange alteration in the course of his life, Pindar develops his theme. In the third stanza of Olympian 12, the song turns to the representation of the angelia. Son of Philinor, that's Ergoteles, indeed the honor of your feet, like a rooster who fights indoors by its native hearth, would have dropped its leaves without fame, had not man-contending civil war robbed you of your homeland Knossos, Crete. But now, having won a crown at Olympia, and twice from Pytho and at the Isthmus, Ergoteles, you take in your hands the nymph's warm waters, living by lands that are your own. That's the end of the poem, straightforward as usual from Pindar. Pindar almost takes on the role of the herald here in this bold enunciation as he turns, and the first 12 lines of this poem are really ruminations on how life changes and we all live on a ship that's constantly going through storms and who knows what will happen. And suddenly he changes and takes on the role of the herald to switch to the representation of the angelia. By the end of the stanza and the song, he's presented almost every element of the proclamation. The victor's name, Ergoteles, his father's name, Philinor, the festival site and an accompanying catalog of other victories. However, in the midst of this ventriloquizing of the herald, Pindar also narrates part of his patron's victory, this man-contending civil war that robbed him of his homeland. Urgateles and this celebratory ode have deep connections, if only poetic and metaphorical, with the social and political setting of Himera and the physical landscape of Sicily. The overriding theme of the ode, the translation of Urgateles from Cretan exile to Himeran citizen and benefactor, relies on the setting of the ode in the space of his new home city. It also relies on the notion that Epenician song can transmit or create identities for its subjects. The authority for creating this identity is Epenician song's representation of the Angelia or proclamation. Whereas the herald who actually announced victories at the Olympic Games, for example, had the ability through performative speech to create identities, by which I mean there's a whole bunch of people who are competing, and the herald says, Flavia won. Flavia is now the victor, new identity. Congratulations, Flavia. The Epenician poet doesn't have this ability, but kind of borrows that authority and uses it to change from proclamation and identification to praise and celebration. In contrast, the epigram. The epigram celebrating Urgateles' full complement of Panhellenic victories was found at Olympia. It was, by all appearances, a product of the undoubtedly flourishing workshops of bronze workers, poets, and sculptors who would have made a living through commissioned works. It reads, in brief, right? Urgateles dedicated me, blah, 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 having defeated the Greeks at the Pythian Games, something, 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 and twice at the Olympics, and twice, something, 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 an immortal memorial for Himera. His epigram, this is it, while mentioned by Pausanias, the 2nd century geographer, was not cited in antiquity and remained unknown until it was excavated at Olympia in 1953. Only half, as you can see, of the bronze plate was intact when it was discovered, hence why the second half of the lines are all missing. But there's lots of good guesses and speculations on what they said based on the meter. I'm not going to go through them. It's not super exciting. But the 4th line for us is perhaps the most interesting part of the epigram for this analysis, since it's here that the author includes mention of Himera, which we know from reading Pindar to be the adopted home of Urgateles. Without Olympian 12, and presuming that there's not really a place after you start to fill in father's name and event and things like that in this epigram to include Crete, without Olympian 12, we'd have no knowledge of Urgateles' actual homeland or the stasis or exile that drove him from it. In fact, the epigram in any possible reconstruction puts forward a completely unproblematic Urgateles, aside from all the problems that come with being an elite Greek male, with no indication of stasis, no indication of his involvement in civil war, immigration, or the assumption of new citizenship. So the implied audience for this poem in Olympia is one for whom Urgateles' troubled past has no resonance, whereas for Himerans, presumably, the rationalization of stasis and exile into fated victory, and importantly, citizenship in their hometown, are crucial elements. In the epigram, by contrast, the transformation is so complete as to avoid it altogether. The focus is on Urgateles as a natural citizen of Himera, shared glory for his city and victor in the spatial confines of a Panhellenic sanctuary like Olympia. So with these two poems in mind as paradigms for how Epenician song and epigram can focus on, but also modify and manipulate the proclamation of victory, I want to turn briefly to heralds across archaic literature, as well as partially in reality, and then the proclamation itself. By establishing thoroughly the ritual authority of the herald and the proclamation in the sanctuary space, it will become clear how Epenician poets and epigrammatic writers borrow the authority of the herald and reconfigure it to praise their victors, and in a broader sense, really structure their songs and poems. And that's an argument I'm not going to get into in this talk, but I do think the Angelia, this proclamation, is like a little kernel at the heart of Epenician poetry, which is sometimes it's often quite expansive and can go to 100, 200, and in one amazing case, even longer in lines. But let's look at heralds first. Heralds and messengers occur first in Homeric epic. Both represent a privileged voice whose claim to authority is based on transparency and precision. Messengers and heralds speak for others and repeat and represent their words with the authority of the composer of the message. Perhaps the example par excellence is Zeus, right? You can't get more authoritative, telling Dream in Iliad 2, speed their deadly dream to the swift ships of the Achaeans. When you come to the tent of Agamemnon, the son of Atreus, say everything exactly as I command. And those of you who've read Homer in Greek especially know that probably when Dream gets there, it's literally the same words that are repeated, sometimes with the person changed, but it's an absolute representation of what Zeus said. And there's a bunch of other examples in the Iliad and Odyssey for this. Given that bards, so moving from heralds and messengers to singers, given that bards represent and repeat the words of the muses or act as mouthpieces of divine voices, they're often considered like heralds or messengers, right? Delivering something that someone else has given them in exactly the right way. Theirs is a voice that claims authority and indeed truthfulness, precision, and authority. These are all aspects of the bard's or herald's voice that connect them with the gods. Their voice claims access, at least in the archaic mindset, to objective truth, stuff that comes from the muses. Plutarch relates an anecdote that emphasizes the equivalence, of athletic and Homeric glory, the herald and the poet, when the 5th century BCE Athenian general Themistocles was asked whether he would have liked to be Achilles, the hero of the Iliad, or Homer, merely its bard, and he responded rhetorically, well, who'd you rather be? The victor in the Olympic Games, Achilles, or simply the herald, Homer? I think the answer is obviously the former. So heralds have this connection with the athletics. They've got an important role to play, but they're imagined, or bards, they're imagined separately. So singers, heralds, messengers can be aligned in a kind of continuum. But heralds and messengers, before their representation in epic or other genres like tragedy, and of course the messenger speech is a huge part of Attic tragedy, are real figures. In athletics, as early as can be detected, heralds were functionaries and then competitors in their own right at athletic festivals. The traditional and literary connection of heralds and divinity would surely add to the authority of athletic heralds. Even prior to the athletic festival at all, heralds played a central role. The theoroi, or ambassadors sent out by the Eleans, for example, to announce the timing of the Olympic festival for the coming year, were hosted in communities across the ancient Greek world and were called heralds. Their journey was called the epangelia, the thing about the proclamation. By the classical period, heralds may also have been given responsibility for calling athletes forward to begin competition. And by 396 BCE, we know that heralds themselves competed at the opening of the games. If you ever need to know how competitive Greeks are, there's a competition to be the person who gets to announce competitions. The voice of the herald therefore permeated athletic landscapes and was the medium through which social, political, and athletic identities intermingled. One of the most important tasks assigned to the herald was the proclamation of victory, the angelia. To be proclaimed victory, in various different Greek words can give this, is a standard phrase meaning to have won. Even in prose accounts of athletics or allusions to athletic victory, lots of examples of this in 6th and 5th century literature. One important and early source of evidence for the proclamation is this detail here from a pseudo-Panathenaic vase that shows an old man, likely a herald, with the words De Niketou Hippos Nike. The horse of De Niketos is the winner, coming from his mouth. And there you can kind of see it going down there with his mouth open. He's speaking. By combining the scant visual evidence, this is basically it, with prose references to the angelia, of which there are many, and representations of the angelia in epigram and epinician, we can reach a clear sense of its standard contents. And this beginning of a victory catalog for the most successful athlete in ancient times, Theogenes of Thasos, gives us a sense. Before listing dozens of Panhellenic victories, we get Theogenes, that's his name, son of Timoxenas, that's his father, from Thasos, won these, and then we just get told event, festival, event, festival, event, festival. Theogenes won like 27 different Panhellenic competitions, so he's abnormal, as well as 1,200 other victories. But nonetheless, even in this superlative athlete, we get a sense of the standard contents of the angelia. So that is victor's name, father's name, city, the age category if not an adult, the event, and a version of the word nikao, he won. Exactly when victors were announced at the Olympics and other festivals is unclear. It may have been directly after the victory or in a common ceremony at the conclusion of the games. Our sources are really unclear on this. It may also have changed over the 1,000-year-long history of the ancient Olympics. In the classical period, at least at Olympia, a Hellenodikos or judge may have crowned the victor, and the coronation, the crowning, and the proclamation, the angelia, are tied together in most ancient discussions of victory. In fact, the proclamation actualizes the victory. It makes it something. It makes a person a victor, as I said about Flavia, which became a great deed only through its verbalization. So an athletic festival is kleos, that is fame, begins from a speech act, not, at least not only, from the observed act of athletic victory. By which I mean that not a lot of athletic writing, whether in poetry or verse in antiquity, talks about what actually happened at the athletic event, like, oh, this guy ran really fast, or he boxed in this particular way. It's mostly about God-given gleam that shines on someone, and then a representation of them being declared a victor. So this Speech Act, the proclamation, is critical then to victory, and then of course to spreading the word. So in trying to expand awareness of their victory, athletes like the heroes of Homeric epic who turned to bards, turned to poets and singers who elaborated on the Speech Act itself, not the Athletic Act. And as I say again, try as you may, you won't find much in terms of sports reporting in Pindar. The only way to ensure that this important announcement and its coupling of athlete and victory was well known was via representation, whether in song that purported to go out across the Greek world, as Pindar says in many of his songs. He imagines them being sent out as messengers, gleaming from treasure houses, or sent out as cargo on ships, or an inscribed form that imagined itself lasting forever at these important sanctuaries like Delphi and Olympia. Representations of the Angelia therefore feature prominently in Epinician and agonistic epigram. I'm just going to give you an example from epigram here. This is a text for probably a long distance runner. It's a very straightforward one. Drimos, son of Theodorus, proclaimed here on that very day an Olympic contest, running into the famous grove of the god, an example of manliness. Equine Argos is my homeland. Even here, it's not so straightforward, right? There's still some little flourishes, an example of manliness. Argos gets this little epithet about being to do with horses and so on. The Angelia is prominent here. It provides the reader with all the information about the victor, and as I said, adds a couple of little flourishes. The transformation of the Angelia in its course of its representation in Epinician and epigrammatic genres, however, significantly alters its character and content, and I've sort of referenced this already. The content of the proclamation is firmly situated in its role in identifying the athlete in the actual contest of a festival. That's what the Angelia does. Flavia won. That's it. It's also divinely inspired because the heralds have either won their place or been given this ritual role at Olympia or Delphi, other places. The Angelia, as it's represented in verse, whether in Epinician poems or in epigrams, I think is a way of claiming this authority through its elusive connection to the apparently transparent, objective, and authoritative voice of the herald. Remember, heralds say things exactly as someone else told them to say. And so this is the ultimate objective truth that Epinician poets and epigrammatists can then borrow for their own poems. Authority is key, since these genres conflate to their advantage proclamation, the public identification of a victor at a festival, with praise, the focus on enhancing the reputation of a single person. While proclamation at a festival may imply praise, it isn't praise necessarily. It's identification. And there's one at least funny, famous example that I think gives us a sense of this. In the case of victory without competitors, something that happened occasionally in Greek sports, right? People would come and see a hulking giant wrestler they were supposed to wrestle, and everyone would say, I withdraw from the competition. And so therefore that guy won. But he didn't actually beat anyone, and he didn't actually compete at all, but he's still given the same victory. So Milo of Croton, one of the most famous athletes in antiquity, won without competition, and then is said, in probably an apocryphal story, to have slipped on the way up to receive his crown. And the audience was to have shouted, you didn't really win, because you just tripped and fell. And if you fall, right, that's part of the losing in the sport. Milo's retort, well, I didn't fall 3 times, which you need to be thrown down, but only once. So someone else come and throw me the other times, is a kind of legendary act. But it shows, right, that the proclamation of victory is distinct from praise. People can still jeer him and say that you didn't actually really win, even though he's obtained the victory. By claiming, therefore, to represent the proclamation or to be the herald, as they do sometimes, Epinician singers and epigrammatic poets conflate proclamation and praise and make it seem as though the praise of their patrons begins from this authoritative, ritually significant, and divinely ordained Angelia. In the form the Angelia reaches us in epigram and Epinician, this representative and contingent aspect is emphasized. It's deployed through genres and forms engaged in the praise of athletes, and at its onset is implicated in both athletic participation and victory. Oh, no, that's too soon. With this overview in mind, I want to turn to some examples from the epigrammatic corpus of how some of what I've discussed may work in practice. That is how the Angelia and the theme of messages and heralds is at the core of athletic praise in ancient Greece, how elements of the Angelia are modified or elaborated upon to change the speech act of proclamation into a poetic and rhetorical act of praise. I'm just going to look at verse inscriptions for the sake of time and because they're generally a little less familiar and less studied texts. I'm sure everyone in this room has read Pindar from cover to cover, and therefore I think they're good ones to show an audience. They're mainly just shorter, so it makes it easier. I could talk about Pindaric questions. So to begin with, a short inscription that uses the theme of messages and heralds. I want to highlight how the theme of the message runs through the inscription, but also how the poet uses this theme to add to the praise of his subject, the equestrian victor Xenombrotus. So the epigram says, "For those who take notice, a true report says that the equestrian victory was most beautiful at that Olympics, where the son of Xenodikos, first of the Coans, seizing the Pisan prize, led it to the island of Merops. Xenombrotus, you see, just as he was. His unquenchable fame Hellas sings as a memorial of horsemanship." The epigram represents itself as a message, though one that is characterized explicitly as true, although the truth is restricted to a subset of the audience, right? For those who take notice, prithumenois. The epigram calls out for an audience, as many do, and presents itself as the bearer of truth to the audience, who turn their attention to and read aloud its contents. The contents of the Angelia follow, though couched in a narrative of excellence. The victor's name, Xenombrotus, his father's name, Xenodicus, his home city or island in this case, Kos, the event, the horse race, and the festival, the Olympics. The inclusion of a boast of special victory, first of the Coans, adds what critics have called surplus value to the victory and represents it as part of the proclamation, especially since this inscription's report, Fatis, is especially true. So surplus victory is a way of just making your victory even better. Again, not good enough to win, got to win and be the best at winning. You've got those competitive ancient Greeks again. The Angelia here, however, is not simply the facts of victory, but the true report is of a most beautiful victory. And the contents of the proclamation are presented so as to end with the victor's name. Xenombrotus' name is prefaced with an appeal to the audience to view the statue that this inscription would have accompanied and to see the victor toios hupoion just as he was. This inscription, which would have been on the base of a statue, uses its statuary accompaniment to restage the proclamation with its own true report, staying in for the herald's Angelia and the victor's statue, a perfect recreation of the victorious Xenombrotus. Now, I will say there's some speculation in that we don't know what almost any of the statues that accompanied these inscriptions looked like. But from what we know from descriptions from Pausanias and from surviving examples, many of them are athletes holding the crown, receiving the crown, or dedicating the crown. So the proclamation and coronation element appear to be a key context for athletic sculpture, at least in the 5th and 4th centuries. The poem ends by situating Xenombrotus' victory in a larger context, both spatially and culturally. Whereas epigrams are generally imagined as stationary and derive their potency as memorials of Klaos from their longevity and their statuary accompaniments, Xenombrotus' epigram is here imagined as the beginning of a kind of oral and especially epic tradition of song. Not only does the text of the epigram report the movement of the prize to Kos, so it's not simply sitting here in Olympia, but in the final 1.5 verses, it claims that Greece will sing Xenombrotus' Kleos Aphthiton, unquenchable fame. Across this line, the epigram integrates itself into epic verse. Kleos Aphthiton, as many will know, unquenchable fame, is the type of fame to which Achilles may lay claim in Iliad 9:4-13. The inscription is the beginning of a song that will be heard not only in Olympia when visitors stop to read it, but as they leave Olympia and travel into the Greek world, it'll be an epic song that traverses the Mediterranean. So for messages and heralds, and there's other examples, so just want to keep it to one. Let's turn to the content of the Angelia and the proclamation of victory as itself. As you're tired of hearing, the proclamation included the name of the victor, his father's name, age, category, and event, and epigrams and epination add, as a matter of course, the festival. You wouldn't say at Olympia, you won at Olympia. It doesn't make much sense, but it's a kind of standard addition. These categories, prosaically reported in the proclamation, identify an athlete, are modified and elaborated upon, even in these very short verse inscriptions for praise. The Angelia at the festival, as you may have realized by now, includes only 2 names, that of the victor and that of his father. Although the victor's name tends to be stable, that's probably not surprising. If you commission someone to give a poem for you, you might want your name in it. Epigrams do on occasion add other possible focuses of praise beyond the victor or father, and in thus doing are elaborating on these categories of proclamation. Poem 879 here, which was found at Amphipolis in Macedonia, shares in a way the glory of victory with someone other than the victor. When Alexander, that Alexander, right, seized the Tyrian island with a spear, he founded the Heraclea with prize-bearing honors. Antigonus, son of Callas, first of the companions, there was wreathed with twin crowns of the hoplitodromos, the race in armor, and the stadion, the short 200-meter sprint. While most of the components of the Angelia are present, victor's name, father's name, event, and festival, the polis of the victor is replaced in a way by another category, I think. Instead of listing his homeland, the epigrammatist has listed another community, that of the companions, the famous companions of Alexander. The composer of the epigram inserts a unique boast of surplus value. He's the first of the companions. Again, not good enough to be one of Alexander's best buddies, right? But you can be the best of that group as well. The boast is structurally similar to other boasts, but Alexander's presence, needless to say, is notable, since the victory links this victory with the conquest of Tyre and Alexander's role as a founder of athletic games. If is as probable the dedication was made at Amphipolis after the death of Alexander the Great, then his name and exploits burnish the glory of Antigonus, and this victory dedication is, in addition to acting as a memorial for victory, a record of martial conquest and the foundation of a set of contests. Another tongue twister. So from a late classical inscription, we can turn back to one of the earliest athletic epigrams to see how other people come into focus. CEG 302 has as its subject Alcmeonides, a member of the powerful Alcmeonidae family in Athens. It reads, again, assuming all the complements and conjectures are correct. I am a beautiful statue of Leto's son Phoebus, which Alcmeonides, the son of Alcmeon, when winning with swift horses, he set me up, which Canopodos drove when the festival of Pallas was in Athens. The dedication was found at the sanctuary of Apollo in Boeotia and dates to the middle of the 6th century, around 540 BCE. It's unusual, especially for that time period, and not being at the site of victory in the victor's hometown. The reference to the charioteer, Canopodos, is highly unusual. Charioteers and jockeys in equestrian sports are almost never included in Epinician or epigrammatic poems. His name is Boeotian in origin, so it's likely he's not a member of the household of Alcmeonides, Athenian. The epigram does not seem to indicate a difference in status between the two. I mean, maybe it's in the missing lines. Alcmeonides gets his father's name, Alcmeon, but maybe Canopodos, and some people have thought Canopodos' father's name could appear in the missing space right in line 4. The layout of the epigram, I don't have a picture of it, sorry to say, is of interest as well. Each participant in the victor receives a full line on one side of the column. So these dashes are indicating line endings. So it's broken up, so you have to move around a column and see the whole thing. Alcmeonides is coupled with this important word algama, statue, and Apollo, latoida. But Canopodos also gets coupled with the event itself and the swift horses. So everyone seems to get a share of some sort of possible good stuff in this epigram. Whether the dedication was located in the sanctuary of Apollo in Boeotia because of the political ambitions of the Alcmeonidae family, or because Canopodos had a special connection with Apollo, is unclear. Maybe this is evidence, some have said, of a network of gift exchanges. So Canopodos' charioteering is a gift to his friend Alcmeonides that permits him to be included, since, as I said, most charioteers don't get mentioned in athletic poetry. Here, therefore, by including elements that were not part of the Angelia, the charioteer, the representation of the victor, or here almost victors, right? It's almost like there's two people, kind of corrects the reality of the proclamation, which would have only mentioned Alcmeonides, the son of Alcmeon, and provides a more inclusive victory, especially if it suits the political or social ambitions of those included. Okay, it's victor's name. So we can move into this next category, which is father's name. The father's name is a key part of the Angelia. Inasmuch as many of you will know, ancient Greeks don't have family names, and therefore father's name is a way to identify a particular person. As I always say to my students in ancient sport, I'm Peter, son of Tom from Oakville, not Peter, son of George from Toronto. Still, beyond acting as a simple identification, fathers' names can sometimes be elaborated upon to build praise for victors, and in some cases, their fathers. So we need father's name to identify someone, but sometimes the proclamation can really use this father's name to do much more than just simply identify this specific athlete. One of the best examples of this is here, CEG 383, the partially preserved dedication of Kiniskos of Mantinea, and offers a prime example of how a composer could exploit the similarity, or in this case, the identity of father and son's names. The statue is missing as normal, but the marble base on which it was inscribed was found in the structure of the Byzantine church built over the ruins of the workshop of Phidias at Olympia. Kuniscus' statue itself is mentioned by Pausanias, who also tells us that he was a boy victor, not an adult, something that's not in the poem. So the poem reads, a boxer, Kuniscos, from famed Mantinea, dedicated this. When he won, he has the name of his father. The two-line epigram, as you can see at the bottom in this drawing, is broken into 5 segments, which circle the feet of the statue and return to the statue's front with the last word of the line. Here's where you would begin, and you have to walk around the whole statue and return to anima, name, right here. So the text guides you around this statue and forces you to see it as a 3-dimensional kind of multimedia object. As audience members stood and gazed at the statue of the crowned youth, they first heard or read Huktos ton Anatheka, this boxer dedicated, before turning to see the right flank of the statue and hearing from famous something or other. Another turn brought them around to the back to complete the victor's name and provide the noun, which famous had modified, that is Mantinea, along with the important word nikon, or winning, having won. Turning around, they read Patros ekon, having something of his father. And the final turn, they got the word anima to end with this shared name of these two men, Kuniscos and his father, Kuniscos. So potent phrases include the opening half line that indicates the event and the act of dedication. Puptos and Anatheka, a boxer, dedicated this. And the name Kuniscos was split across the corner of inscription. And the final anima, the last word, name, which ends the inscription and forces the audience to come right back to where they started at the beginning. The text, and to some extent the meter, though I think it's a little less clear there, of the epigram led the readers around the statue and displayed to them, as they read it aloud or heard it read aloud to them, the youthful image of an athlete crowning himself, a multimedia conflation of proclamation and coronation. Within this complex text, the unusual last half stands out, Patros ekon onoma, having the name of his father. The evidence for proclamations, of course, suggests that the regular formula would have announced this victor as Kuniscos, son of Kuniscos, not Kuniscos, who had the same name as his father. And the proclamation would also include the age category, as Pausanias tells us, a boy, not a man, not an adult. In Kuniscos' epigram, however, age category is absent, and the epigram instead stresses the identity and similarity of the names of father and son. Since Kuniscos was a boy, we may safely assume the commissioning and phrasing of the epigram were out of his hands, and the unusual phrasing for the father deserves some scrutiny. Those of you who are involved in children's sports, and I know there's one here, might be thinking about their own lives here. Again, the layout of the inscription may emphasize this point. Except for the actual beginning, Huktos ton Anatheka, only the left side of the base could serve as a grammatically and metrically comprehensible beginning, Patros ekon. You could only start from 2 places in this and actually realize you might be at the beginning of the poem. You'd figure out Patros ekon was wrong quite soon, but nonetheless, you could theoretically begin there. The other 2 sides begin of portions of words that are nonsense by themselves. So this suggestion is correct. The layout of the inscription ensures that even a partial reading, even some semi-literate person who walks up to the statue and has no idea where to start, could begin at the wrong place and still speak aloud the glory of the Father. The glory of victory through the proclamation of the Father's name and the celebration of victory at home reflects well on the family and clan of the victor. We know this from lots of different evidence. The extension of glory could work to reintegrate the victor to his community, as has been well established in scholarship, and to extol the virtues of his extended family. But this epigram and its unusual naming formula go a little further than that. The absence of the age category and the shared name between father and son stress the sharing of the glory of victory as well. Sharing of things between father and son, at Olympia especially, is important, since at Olympia, for boy victors, it was fathers who had to accompany them to swear an oath as well, in order to ensure that they would not violate the sanctity of the games and follow all the rules. So fathers had a role to play at Olympia for boy victors. In the memorialization of victory in this epigram, shared glory is paramount, since a casual observer, which I think we all qualify as 2,500 years later, could not have realized which Kuniscos had won in the event. The herald's proclamation emphasized a specific guy, Kuniscos, son of Kuniscos. The representation of the proclamation, the epigram, instead just says Kuniscos. This is a firm belief maybe in the actuality of inherited ability. In fact, the epigram forces us to gaze at the statue, a stand-in for victor and father. The epigram's phrasing forces Kuniscos' father, unnamed except paraphrastically, on the sidelines of his victory, and makes him the rationale for the victory. By modulating ever so slightly the proclamation, the statue and its accompanying inscription institute a proclamation that is embedded in ideology, that is, a belief in inherited excellence or that fathers could play a role in their sons' accomplishments, rather than a simple representation of the herald's voice. Okay, as I mentioned earlier, cities are part of the proclamation. Cities are part of the organizing principle of the games altogether, since those Elean heralds go from city to announce the Olympics. But they're also part of athletes' names. Like fathers' names, they're used to specify a particular person. They're used with great frequency to identify individuals in inscriptions when the individual is outside of their city. But when they're inside the city, often the city name is left off, right? So we know who George, son of Tom is when we're here in Winnipeg, but we might need to add of Winnipeg when we go outside of Winnipeg. Like a city, father's name is part of identity, but again, it can be used to add glory to victory. And so here's one brief example, at least, in CEG 855, where the actual history of the city is brought to bear and its colonial connections become an avenue for additional praise. Magnesian and race, for my stadion victory in the boys' race at Pytho, that's Delphi, with this statue crowned me did my city, which lies by the flowing of the Meander, and horse-rearing Thessaly is said to be the motherland of my fatherland. The epigram, which is on a limestone base at Delphi, connects itself to the victor's homeland specifically. It's awarded him the praise and statue and speaks his praise. The home polis in its description occurs in 3 of the 4 lines of the epigram. The last line, however, is unusual. Magnesia on the Meander was founded, so the epigram claims, legate, it's said, by Thessalians. Although this claim to a connection with through this claim to a connection with Thessaly, the epigram offers a bit more glory, I think, to the victor's victory, since although he's won in a foot race, which is a pretty prestigious victory, but not the best type, by being connected to Thessaly, it implicitly suggests some link with equestrian victories, since Thessaly was not only the most famous horse breeding region in Greece, but the home of the best equestrian people. So even in an epigram for a victor in foot races, the history of his city here kind of gives him access to praise of equestrian victors as well. And I've noted that his name can't fit in the meter of an epigram, so it had to be in a prose thing at the top. Too bad for him. Yes. Parents should have named him better to make sure that he could be an athletic victor, I guess, right? You keep that in mind when naming your children. Okay, event. So event is key, even if athletic praise in ancient Greece, as I've mentioned, does not begin, as usually in our own, from the amazing achievement of an athlete in competition, but rather from their proclamation as a victor. Epigrams and epination poems, as I've said, rarely approach sports reporting, and great achievements tend to be overshadowed by the assumption that divine influence played a role in victory. Still, to a lesser extent than the other components of the Angelia, events can be made to play a role in praise, no more so, I think, than in verse epigrams that are inscribed on equipment that was actually used in competitions, kind of game-used equipment. So here on the screen, you can see the epigram and the object itself, CEG 372, which is inscribed in a stone jumping weight or halter used in the competition of the pentathlon. Remember, the pentathlon has the javelin, long jump, and discus, and then running and wrestling. Those first 3 events are only competed in the pentathlon. So if you see a jumping weight, it's got to be a pentathlete. I'll read the epigram, right? It was founded at Olympia and dated to 500. It's very short. Agmatidas, the Lacedaemonian, dedicated this, having won the pentathlon. Maybe the word means without dust. It's unclear what askonikti means, but most people think it means without dust. The epigram includes several elements of the Angelia: victor's name, polis, and event. It builds a brief narrative by signaling the special type of victory that Agmatidas has won in the pentathlon, as I just said, askonikte. This word, which appears only here in all of ancient Greek, has generally been understood as an error of the scribe, which happens, or a dialectical variation of akoniti, that means without dust. Akoniti could mean without dust in the case of Milo of Croton there, who didn't have to put on the dust that one does when they wrestle, and won without competition. But in the context of the pentathlon, it's generally taken to assume without applying dust to the skin in preparation for wrestling. So to win the pentathlon, that would be a whole 9-week course to understand how you win it. But generally speaking, you have to win 3 of 5 events. And so if you sweep the first 3 field events, javelin, long jump, and discus, you've won the pentathlon and don't need to run, and most importantly, don't need to wrestle. So wrestling specialists might want to try and get good at the other things, but if you could be really good at the unique events, you could avoid the stadion and wrestling today. I think decathletes and pentathletes and such, work on this as well, and triathletes certainly do. So if the most common order of events is understood, where the field events happened first, along with the fact that the inscription is on a jumping weight, they would have been used, right, to jump in the long jump, it seems most probable that readers of this epigram would understand a sweep of the field events, or at least that he avoided wrestling. And in other inscriptions and poems for pentathlete victors, we often get told as a special boast of victory, and I didn't have to wrestle, right? As if that was something to avoid, which again, if you're facing some of these hulking Greek athletes, it probably was if you were a good sprinter. So Achmatidas's epigram begins to generate narrative, not only of the circumstances of dedication, but also athletic success itself. CEG 299 is another halter, different shape. And I apologize, the image is like literally the best one that you can buy if you spend money on it even, on the right. So that's what it looks like. But I had someone draw it for me once with a better eye than I have. So that's what you see on the left. So CEG 299 is a lead weight discovered at Eleusis and dedicated by Epinetus, dated to 575 to 550 BCE. And it combines a narrative of athletic success like the previous example with a rationale for dedication. Having jumped, Epinetus won because of these two jumping weights. So keen-eyed people might be thinking that I added the word to, but just to clarify, tada at the end of that line has to be a dual by meter. And so that has to mean these two things. Right, so there probably was another one. Mike is going to check it for me as I'm speaking. I see. So this means that there were probably two of these, right? And the other one is long gone. The epigram doesn't contain much of the Angelia, unless, of course, that missing second halter, oh, that would be nice to have, right? Provided father's name in contest. But Epinetus's dedication evokes the narrative possibilities inherent that come from the event and the dedication of athletic equipment. This halter speaks to us. It's because of this exact thing in that exact event that I won the pentathlon. On account of this, that I won my victory. So these, it's a whole other kind of selection of items, I think, events, but equipment, I should say. And they're only short-lived in terms of having inscriptions, but they kind of connect with the victory in a different way. Okay, last thing to do is the festival site. So just one example. The potential for epigrams to use the space of a festival site, that is a religious sanctuary of really great importance, right? Olympia and Delphi are more than just sports facilities, of course. And the narrative of the Angelia to generate powerful, if unreal, epigrammatic proclamations is exemplified in the epigram and statue dedication of the Spartan princess Kuniska. Kuniska is a fitting final example of how epigrams elaborate on the site of victory and use their physicality and materiality to mean something. The epigram and statue does something narratively by means of its presence. The statue group and epigram combine to contribute to its meaning, and perhaps most importantly, in the geography of a sanctuary, to give it some sort of broader meaning than just a win. Kuniska's in particular, her boast to gendered supremacy has additional meaning at Olympia, since as many of you will know, women's participation, indeed attendance at all, was highly regulated at Olympia. And it's a long-standing scholarly discussion, but definitely married women were not allowed at Olympia. Perhaps unmarried girls were. So it's basically a male space. Kuniska is a Spartan princess and the first female Olympic chariot victor. She won the Forest chariot at the Olympics of 396 and again at 392. Her statue, which was not far from the temple of Olympian Zeus, Pausanias tells us, was beside the statue of another countryman named Anaxandros, and it must have been striking to visitors throughout the centuries. Her lifelike posture, pose, and scale placed a physical manifestation of the female form in the very sanctuary to which women were forbidden entry on penalty of death during the Olympic Games. It reads, "Spartan kings are my fathers and brothers, but victorious with a chariot of swift-footed horses, Kuniska set up this statue. And I declare that I alone of women from all of Greece seized this crown. Oh, also Apuleius, the son of Calliclaeus, made it." Okay, the artist gets his due too. Since antiquity, the short poem has been interpreted as evidence for Kuniska's reasons for competing, the intentions of her brother, the Spartan king Agesilaus. In a kind of biographical criticism of this sort, Kuniska's victory has become an afterthought, an immortalizing tale, an accomplishment to be eclipsed by their victories, or an event that only possesses meaning in the context of male political machinations. Here, however, in keeping with the theme of my talk, the epigram, site, and statue take center stage. The Angelia, of course, is a proclamation of identity, and as might be expected from an announcement generated from the competitive athletic context in ancient Greece, it constitutes a series of nested masculine elements. The victor, almost always a man, A father, by definition, a man. A home polis, a community of men. Given the masculine context of athletic competition celebration, agonistic epigrams are really a type of masculine speech. And if this is the case, the representation of the Angalia in Kuniska's epigram represents a significant intrusion of a feminine voice into a masculine genre. It's crucial for the interpretation of Kuniska's epigram that the actual proclamation was enunciated during the festival when Kuniska could not have been there. Her victory was performed when she wouldn't have been allowed entry either. That is, the victory was performed, proclaimed, and I guess she was crowned without actually being there at all. The statue and epigram in this instance is more present than the victor by being in Olympia, and far from replacing an absent victor, as some have suggested statues did, the statue here is the only presence the victor ever had in the sanctuary. Her victory records a different victor than one recorded in Androcentric writings from around and after her lifespan. In her epigram, the generality of the first lines, right, it's just Spartan kings, not like my brother Agesilaus, who's literally the king right now campaigning off in the Near East. Spartan kings, the lack of any proper names other than her own in the poem, emphasize her glory. Spartan kings past and present, her father, her brother, are marginalized through namelessness. They function as props to burnish her victory through reflected divinity and royalty. The poem implicitly claims a heroic status, and we know that Kuniska was worshipped as a hero at Sparta after death, in keeping with the religious status of her ancestors, all of whom were worshipped like she was. The Kuniska of the epigram shares nothing of her athletic victory and presents herself as simply a powerful person. Her victory, its uniqueness only adding to her arete, supports her own claim to heroic stature. Now, of course, everyone on earth who's ever read this has noticed that she seems to be the first gendered record in agonistic epigram, and it's a first that fits the other ones I've shown, right? First of the Cohens, first of the companions, and now she's not first, but alone of all women. So she's going a bit further than everyone else. But this first, unlike first of the Cohens, for example, and all the other different types of surplus value boasts, does not represent or reflect the Angalia, and it's not based on one of those categories, since of course the Herald's proclamation did not record the gender of the victor. Evocation and representation of the Angalia was not confined to these, but they could kind of add to these core elements, like I've said. Kuniska's first is not fit. It's not related to family, to city, or to combination of events and festivals. First to win this many things, first to win at this place. It grafts another category onto the Angalia and embeds in the typical language of athletic boasts, the most extreme of, therefore, the unreal additions to the Angalia that attempt to correct reality. Thinking way back, right, to that charioteer Canopodos that was included in an attempt to share fame. With Kuniska's epigram, it's impossible to understand a meaningful representation of the herald's message. The audience could simply hear the first-person forms of male dedicators as indirectly reporting that herald's speech, the exact thing, right, the truth that the herald had said. But such a semantic switch was unbelievable in the case of Kuniska. Not only would she not have been present at Olympia to hear the proclamation or receive her crown, no proclamation of victory would have included gender. In this way, Kuniska's epigram does not simply obscure gender through the use of a masculine poetic device. Rather, she acts as a ventriloquist of the herald, like other athletes, and still borrowing his authority and his role and his ritual significance. But the gendered boast problematizes athletic identity and indeed this whole genre in its enunciation. It emphasizes gender as the special component of her victory. Paradoxically, in the context of masculine competitive athletics, her victory is feminine. The centrality of femininity establishes an unreal scenario. Her boast replicates the structure of the proclamation, but it subverts the importance of representing actual ritual and affects a breach in these conventions. And so it's the example that kind of blows apart this idea that the Angalia is right at the core, even as she also bases it on there. So I'm going to end it there. From Homer to the Hellenistic period and beyond, one of the defining features of ancient Greek cultural history and its ongoing interpretation and adaptation is athletic competition. For the ancient Greeks, athletics, along with warfare, was a primary area for the contestation of status and for the attainment of superiority and excellence. Writers in antiquity, as I've mentioned in this talk, recognize this central role. Some of you may know, Thucydides' Pericles stresses competitive festivals as one of the things that makes Athens great. Herodotus includes common festivals in his famous definition of Greekness. And the Persians, of course, marvel that the Greeks contend not for money, but for arete. Pindar as frequently puts it best when he says, "He who wins luxurious glory in games or as a soldier, by being praised gains the highest profit, the finest words from the tongues of citizens and foreigners." So today in this talk, I've endeavored to trace the ways in which Pindar, well, just in one example, but mostly the anonymous composers of inscribed epigram have structured the praise that would grant their patrons what Pindar called the highest profit. Thank you very much.
It's also trade, poetry, and sport in ancient Greece. And does anyone have any questions?